Hello, and today we're going to go over the formation of the National Liberation Front, a look at the Viet Cong and how they won over the South. We're going to cover the background to 1949, the exit of the French, the Geneva Accords, the Diem era, how a small group banded together, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, hiding in the jungles and farms, fighting tactics, the Americas' response, and a South's winning strategy. I'm going to talk about the history of Vietnam. Now, the Hong Bang dynasty was known as the first Vietnamese state, and it was established around 257 BC. They lasted until the invasion from China, and by 111 BC, most of Vietnam was incorporated into China. Now, in 938 AD, the Vietnamese defeated the forces of Chinese Southern Han State at the Bac Dang River, and it achieved full independence. Vietnamese was independent most of the time, but it was briefly interrupted by the Chinese Ming Dynasty in 1407, but it was quickly restored. Now, by the 16th century, there was a lot of infighting, and different Vietnam forces were trying to rule the country. In come the French. Vietnam's independence was gradually eroded by France, and it was aided largely by the Catholic militias in a series of military conquests, and by 1884, the entire country was under French rule. They were divided into central and northern parts of Vietnam, separated into proctorate. They were called Annam and Tonkin, and 3 Vietnamese entities were under the Union of the French Indochina in 1887. They introduced the plantation economy, they introduced Catholicism, and a Western style of education. And they controlled Vietnam until World War II, when Japan forces took over. But after the defeat of Japan in 1945, the Japanese had to retract their forces, and the Viet Minh declared independence in northern Vietnam and occupied Hanoi. And the French, they tried to restore colonial rule, and this began the Indochina War. Now, the French and northern Vietnam fought a lot. The fighting took place mostly in northern Vietnam near Hanoi and Tonkin, where the French were trying to gain control over the north. There was a major battle in 1954 called the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where the French were defeated, overwhelmed by the forces of the Viet Minh, and had to withdraw their forces. So in comes the Geneva Accords, which was held in 1954. It was supposed to go over the Korean War, the Indochina War, and what exactly to do with the Vietnam. Now, what was decided there was that it would divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel. They would have a 3-mile wide demilitarized zone. The French forces would regroup in the south, and the Viet Minh forces would regroup in the north. People were allowed to move freely for about 300 days between the north and the south, and it was one of the largest migrations. And neither side was supposed to seek military alliance from outside forces, and an established International Control Commission, which was neutral and independent. So after the Geneva Accords in 1955, Diem was appointed Prime Minister of the Southern Vietnam. Elections were supposed to be held in 1956 to reunify all of Vietnam, but Diem said that it was not going to happen because he felt that the conditions were not good in northern Vietnam to hold free elections. He was very corrupt president. He was Catholic, and he was against a lot of the Buddhists and a lot of the religious traditions of a lot of the people, and ultimately people didn't support him and called him a colonial a front or an American sympathizer, and there was a lot of forces in southern Vietnam that were grouping and to overthrow him. Now, after the free elections did not happen, the North, led by Ho Chi Minh, they were not happy, and so they were going to organize the National Liberation Front, which began in 1960, as a way of winning over the South, or to defeat the Southern forces, the government in the South. Hanoi gave the members of the National Liberation Front training, weapons, and supplies. It helped them establish and develop and maintain, the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia, and it provided a lot of support and manpower. And without the support from the Viet Cong would never have been able to defeat the forces in the South. Now I want to talk about the Ho Chi Minh Trail and how the North got the supplies to the South. Now in 1959, Hanoi established the 559th Transportation Group, and they were in charge of improving and maintaining a transportation system that would supply the National Liberation Front. They had about 6,000 troops, and they didn't include the combat troops as well as the Laotian civilian laborers, and these all helped secure and maintain the trail. The trail was a combination of 18-foot wide roads. They had bicycle trails, trucks, storage bunkers, barracks, and hospitals. They had camouflage, and without the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the National Liberation Front would not have been able to regroup and get their supplies. Now, the members of the National Liberation Front, they had an army called the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam, or PLAF. And many of these people, they were from the farms, they were from civilian populations, they were sympathizers, and they hid in elaborate tunnels in the farms that led out to the jungles that were towards the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They had bathrooms there, they had, bunkers. They were elaborate tunnels underground that the Americans couldn't find, and they were amongst the farms in the rural areas, and this was a great fighting tactic, a great hiding tactic, to be able to, go out and fight, and then come back and hide in these small little tunnels, and be able to regroup their forces. Now, America's response to the National Liberation Front's tactics, they had air power, a lot of helicopters and planes. They had a really well-organized Navy, and they had special forces. But the guerrilla tactics of the NLF were a little overwhelming, and it wasn't traditional. So the Americans didn't quite know how to respond in these war tactics. Now, the National Liberation Front had a lot of different war tactics. They taught their soldiers to learn to adapt with very little being given to them. They used elaborate booby traps that ranged from simple sticks in the ground covered in human feces to bullet traps and explosives. They had an idea of what was called the 4 quicks, 1 slow fighting method, where they would slowly plan, they quickly advance their forces, they would quickly attack, they would clear the area of enemy, and then they would quickly withdraw back to the jungles and the farms where they could regroup and plan another attack. Now, the Tet Offensive was held on the Tet holiday, which is the Vietnamese New Year, and it was an attack that was coordinated between the North and the South in 1968. They coordinated the attack to attack over 300 towns, the U.S. Embassy, a lot of different forces, and this sort of sent a message to America that they didn't belong there, and they were kind of overwhelmed by this coordinated attack. Now, the National Liberation Front eventually won the war. It overwhelmed the American forces, but ultimately the northern Vietnam, the Viet Minh, took over the National Liberation Front, and they replaced all of the southern Vietnamese people with their people. So it didn't ultimately survive because northern Viet Minh, they took over in key positions. So that's my presentation on the National Liberation Front. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you.